Welcome to Indigo Naturals and our deep dive into CBD and anxiety. Look, we spend a few hours daily in NIH studies on CBD, so you don't have to. The research on our main review can get pretty technical despite our best efforts. So we're going to wrap up the main pathways in this video, knowing that you have the studies below to support it. If you have any questions, please shoot them over, as we love to point people in the right direction. Let's get right into it. We're going to first look at two key pathways tied to anxiety, as it's really important to understand what's driving it before we jump into how CBD actually works there. There's both a long-term and a short-term aspect we're going to look at. Let's start with the longer-term pathway, the so-called anxiety circuit. First, long-term pathways, starting with actual brain areas tied to anxiety. Think of this as trait anxiety, or a general feeling of anxiousness all the time, maybe all your life, or after a certain trigger like trauma. There's a known anxiety circuit involving two brain areas called the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The what? Look, stay with us. It's really interesting and critical to understanding what's going on when you're anxious. It's the intersection between our really old brain, the so-called reptilian brain, and our newer brain, what makes humans human. The amygdala is the old part, evolutionarily speaking, and it's the heart of emotional response. Think of it as the emotional gate for how we perceive the world, and more importantly, respond to it. So love, hate, impulse, fear. Did you catch that last one? Fear. Anxiety resides here. It's constantly sending signals like a threat detection system. If we only had an amygdala with no counterbalance, the prefrontal cortex, we would be a teenager. In fact, during puberty, the counterbalance to all of these distress signals gets turned off as the prefrontal cortex is remodeled for the adult brain, the rational brain. Yes, we have many voices all competing for the mic up there. It keeps the amygdala in check, and long-term or general anxiety can be tied in research to either an amygdala that's too active or strong, or a prefrontal cortex that's not keeping up. Well, what's driving this imbalance? Here's what research is finding. Damage can occur to the prefrontal cortex at times of development or just during life itself, from things like chronic stress, trauma, hyperactive immune response, chemicals, drugs, genetics, and even imbalances in the gut. A host of things, really. These can literally eat up the prefrontal cortex's ability to dampen down the amygdala's threat and fear response. This leads to a range of different issues, from OCD to repetitive and negative thoughts to anxiety. Let's now dig a little deeper. We've looked at the brain circuit. Let's go a little deeper into the nuts and bolts of how it works right now, day to day, with the neurotransmitters. If brain structure points to long-term anxiety, the nuts and bolts of this process occurs with neurotransmitters. We'll focus on two key pathways that'll be very interesting with CBD later on. GABA and glutamate, which is the brake and the gas pedal of the brain, and then serotonin, the master controller of all human behavior and a key stress response player. First, let's look at GABA and glutamate. Let's zoom in on GABA, since it's the target of benzos, the primary medication for anxiety, which happen to be very addictive and quickly build tolerance. That means you're left worse off than when you started. GABA has the following effects with increasing levels. First calm, then sedated, then hypnotic, amnesiac, anesthetic, and with levels that are too high, dead. Again, it's the brake pedal in the nervous system, so an excess of it can actually stop brain function. In fact, barbiturates, which came before the benzos, had a bigger issue there. It's a steady reduction in brain or nervous system activity. It's key to both sleep and reducing anxiety. In fact, we have a whole comparison of CBD and benzos on our site with a link below. This is the immediate turn anxiety off lever. Longer term, we have to look at serotonin, the target of SSRIs. Serotonin is somewhere between right now with GABA and then the brain areas we talked about before, which were longer term. In fact, it may be the driver of the long-term traits. That's why it takes a few weeks for SSRIs to actually start working for depression, when they do for about 30% of the people, until they stop working due to tolerance, that thing we talked about before with benzos. We have a whole comparison of SSRIs and CBD below. Besides calming our stress response and figuring directly into things like self-esteem and resilience, serotonin has a side hustle, maybe the most important piece of the anxiety and depression puzzle, BDNF. Let's take a look at this in detail, since it is the key to long-term brain change and anxiety. Neurogenesis and BDNF. BDNF is short for neurotrophic brain-derived factor. Yeah, we're going to stay with BDNF. Thanks. Basically, it's the brain's fertilizer and key to a process called neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is a fancy way to say brain repair, or replenishment even. This is how the brain fights back against stress, infection, any kind of damage that we talked about above, really. Here's where things get interesting. When BDNF function is blocked, SSRIs lose their ability to boost neurogenesis. Consequently, they lose their antidepressant effects. To make it even more interesting, when CB1 receptors, and that's where CBD operates in the endocannabinoid system, when those receptors are blocked, this all goes away as well. Aha, we're getting closer. People, we've been using SSRIs to boost serotonin, but really, this was a workaround to get more BDNF. This is showing up everywhere in research. Exercise, it boosts BDNF. Mindful meditation, more BDNF. Psilocybin, an explosion of BDNF. We have a whole review on psilocybin because it's going to be a really big deal for mental health in the next few years until CRISPR comes online. A quick note for ladies, especially during cycles including the big ones like puberty, perimenopause, menopause. Progesterone directly drives GABA. Estrogen directly drives serotonin. Goodness. And so when your doctor tells you, oh, your levels are fine for your age, find a new doctor. Look, net, BDNF is critical to every mental health issue we've studied, and especially for addiction. A well-connected brain is a healthy brain, and BDNF is also a great segue into CBD. So, how does CBD work in the pathways we've gone over? Let's go over the key drivers, knowing that the research is on the main page. First, we need to understand how CBD works in general. It's a great introduction to the endocannabinoid system. This is a system we all have, we share with all animals. It dates back about 600 million years, and it's tasked with balancing other key systems, such as neurotransmitters, the nervous system, the endocrine system, which would be hormones, and the immune system, which would be inflammation. There are two really important aspects on how CBD works within the system that make it very different from most other substances and even from things like THC, which is also a cannabinoid. First of all, it operates like a feedback mechanism within the endocannabinoid system. So where things like THC will push levels up in certain pathways in one direction, CBD doesn't do that. Technically, it's called an allosteric negative modulator. That's just a fancy way to say it will support something if it's low, but won't continue if it goes high. And that's why on the side effect profile, it's so much better even at very high levels up to 1500 mgs that they tested. That feedback mechanism is incredibly important to how CBD works because you don't want to push pathways, especially very important pathways like GABA or glutamate or serotonin in one direction or you build tolerance. And that's what we see with benzos, which push GABA up in one direction. With SSRIs, you can build tolerance. And with even THC, which pushes up CB1 activity in the endocannabinoid system, the net result is the body pushes back when you use it long term, and you actually end up worse than when you started. So that feedback mechanism is very important. And let's give an example of how that actually works. A perfect one would be around oxidative stress or inflammation. So if you have a healthy cell in the body with low inflammation, CBD won't have much effect. If you have a healthy cell in the body with high inflammation, it'll actually reduce the inflammation. If you have a cancerous or virally infected cell, CBD will actually increase the inflammation. Now think about that. 3 different states, 3 different results. The last one makes sense once you realize that the way the body gets rid of bad cells is to jack up inflammation in the form of oxidative stress and kill it. Essentially, radiation and chemo are giant boosts of oxidative stress. So this is all a function of the immune system, and CBD is actually affecting that in a positive way, but there are 3 different results, and that's the beauty of the feedback mechanism that makes CBD so different from all the other substances and even other cannabinoids. Okay, we've got the general lay of the land out of the way. Let's go back to the pathways we were talking about. First, GABA and glutamate. CBD operates in the feedback function mentioned above for GABA, and also for glycine, which is a lesser known inhibitory neurotransmitter. In this way, it supports GABA, which is generally outgunned during states of anxiety. For serotonin, it also operates as a support system when exhausted. In the research, you constantly see words like moderate or normalize, which is critical. Too much serotonin, which is called serotonin syndrome, is brutal. It's actually quite dangerous. Serotonin really needs to be in a pretty good range. There are issues if it's too low, there are issues if it's too high. In many studies, after injury or chronic stress, CBD was able to bolster serotonin function when it was falling short. As we learned from above, the real star behind the curtain is BDNF. So what about CBD and that pathway? CBD has been shown to boost BDNF function and synaptic plasticity. Essentially, that means the little root system of the brain reaching out, forming connections, becoming more interconnected, especially in 2 very important brain areas. The first one we've already talked about, the prefrontal cortex. The second one is called the hippocampus, and it's the seat of memory, but more importantly, mood control. And it is highly vulnerable to all the various insults we talked about, like stress, for example. So for CBD to boost neurogenesis and BDNF in these areas is really important for anxiety, depression, and really just good mental health. The bigger question is this: what's heating up our serotonin or overwhelming our GABA? Here are the various insults and what CBD does. Chronic stress. CBD calms the trigger and messenger of stress called corticotropin releasing factor and cortisol, our primary stress hormone. Trauma or acute stress. CBD not only calms stress response, but supports the ability to forget bad memories. It's something called fear extinction. Immune response and inflammation. CBD calms immune response and inflammation when too high, especially neuroinflammation or inflammation in the brain and nervous system. Excessive glutamate. CBD bolsters GABA's role in this tug of war, which is so critical. Oxidative stress. CBD is actually a more powerful antioxidant than vitamin C or E. Gut imbalance. CBD supports our gut barrier, which is a key inflammation thermostat across the body and the brain. We have breakout reviews on all of these aspects with lots and lots of NIH research. CBD has been compared head-to-head against benzos and SSRIs with equal effect. It does not build tolerance, and it is not addictive. This is so important when comparing benzos and SSRIs. Remember, calming the insults, inflammation, oxidative stress, immune response, chronic stress, is half the battle. The other side is repair, and that's neurogenesis, which brings us to our next section. How much CBD for anxiety? We actually have some pretty good research that shows there's a bell curve response to CBD for neurogenesis. Remember, that's our ultimate goal, to repair and replenish and build new brain connections. That was key to anxiety, to depression, and a host of mental health issues. And what they're finding is 300 mgs daily was the peak level of neurogenesis. It ramps up as you're lower than that, and when you hit 300, the neurogenesis aspect starts to go down. So what that tells us is, for longer term use, 300 mgs per day is kind of the optimal target. Now, everyone is different based on weight, liver function, all these different attributes that figure into how fast or how effective CBD is for you. So you may find results much lower than that. For acute issues, there are studies on everything from schizophrenia to social anxiety and public speaking that were at 600 to 800 mgs one-time use. So that would be more of a critical or acute situation, but long-term, the research is pointing to that 300 mgs for boosting neurogenesis to the maximum level available. Then there's the question of what's the best CBD for anxiety? There are definitely some mandatory requirements we need with any CBD product. It needs to be organically grown hemp in the USA at an FDA-registered farm. This is essential. It also needs to be third-party tested to make sure that it's clear of contaminants and that the CBD levels are accurate, which is a big issue right now in the marketplace. It needs to be CO2 processed, which is much cleaner. And in the third-party testing, it needs to show no THC. THC actually can cause anxiety if you have a histamine response to it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It needs to have no solvents, no heavy metals, no pesticides, no mold, no bacteria. That should all be reflected in the third-party testing. Then there's the question of CBD isolate versus CBD full or broad spectrum. And that's a whole nother topic, and we have a full section discussing how that's different. CBD isolate is CBD by itself. Full spectrum is generally all the cannabinoids or hemp oil in one substance. Here's the issue that many people find out the hard way, as we did. Roughly 40 to 60% of people have histamine issues, allergic reactions. This goes up as we get older, and for women, because progesterone is leaving the stage and progesterone calms immune response. Here's the issue. CBD isolate by itself has been shown to calm histamine response. We see that in studies on asthma and a host of different issues. However, the full spectrum with all the plant material, other cannabinoids, can cause a histamine response. And so the side effect profile can be very different between isolate and full spectrum. And there's very little research on full spectrum CBD. So a lot of people will try CBD. We tried 3 of the 4 of the biggest brands out there and had an immediate histamine response. Everything from skin irritation to GI issues. You can see it in our Google reviews in terms of a different side effect profile. Interestingly, those effects or responses go away with CBD isolate, which is what we found originally, and that's why we focus on isolate, plus all the research is there. Why is this important for anxiety? Take a look at the side effect profile of an antihistamine medication. Usually it's sedation, calm, sleepy. Basically, histamine can provoke or create an anxiety state because it's a neurotransmitter. Besides just getting bad stuff out of your body, it actually has powerful effects against GABA. In fact, there's a powerful anti-anxiety drug, which is basically just an antihistamine. We don't want to create a histamine response in the brain because it's excitatory, which means it's eating up GABA. The final piece is affordability. Look, if we're looking at 300 mgs daily for anxiety, then we have to be able to afford this. And that's why we price the 6,000 bottle at about 2 to 3 cents per mg of CBD, which is really the key thing to look at. When you start to look at this cost per mg of CBD, you realize that a big chunk of the market is incredibly overpriced. I mean, multiples higher. That will eventually, hopefully, calm down, but in the meantime, we price at 2 to 3 cents per mg before discounts up to 30 or 50%. I mean, the reason being is we found CBD via a brutal rolling anxiety period. And see, we want people to be able to not only take advantage of it, but go based on research in terms of levels that actually can help with anxiety. If you have any questions, please let us know below. We have 1 million+ words of research on CBD, and so we really go deep into it. In the meantime, be well, take care of each other, and take care of yourself.